Hello, and welcome. Welcome on into the swear word. I'm your host, Brandon Swear. And hey, this is a podcast for the chilihead community, by the chilihead community. Regardless of your spice tolerance, this is the place for you. Up tonight, we're going to be talking about copper in the garden. We're talking everything from pipes, wires, bars, and soil. Ultimately, the reality of it, the benefits, the risks, and smart use cases for peppers and beyond. So episode 192 starts now. What's going on, Swear Nation? So glad to have everyone here, whether you're tuning in on YouTube, Spotify, Rumble, and or Apple Podcasts. Thank you so much for being here or continuing to make this podcast what it is. Today, we're going to be diving into one of the most controversial and honestly, one of the most misunderstood topics in modern gardening. That's copper. So now, depending on where you spend your time online, you've probably seen copper used in all kinds of ways. Everything from copper pipe to copper wire, copper rods, you got copper tape, there's copper mesh, there's copper coils, and then people just start to wrap it around posts. They bury it next to their tomato plants. They stick rods into their raised beds. They run it through the hydroponic systems. And some people even build elaborate electroculture antennas, claiming that they can dramatically increase the overall plant growth. So if you've spent any kind of time scrolling through gardening TikTok or YouTube, or you have a Facebook gardening group, or maybe you're out there even just talking with longtime gardeners, you've probably heard some statements that would be similar to this. Copper has changed my garden. Copper has doubled my harvest. Or copper cured my diseases. Copper has absolutely stopped every slug. Or on the flip side of that, you've heard statements that are quite the opposite. Things like copper is useless. It's all pseudoscience. Or just don't waste your money on that. So the real question becomes, who's right? And that is exactly where we're going to start exploring here today. And one thing that I want to make very clear right from the beginning is that this isn't going to be a podcast that's trying to convince you that copper is some kind of miracle material. And it isn't going to be a podcast that's telling you that every traditional gardening practice involves some form of copper nonsense. Because honestly, I don't think either extreme serves gardeners very well. And one thing that I've learned over the years of growing in general is just being able to do things like talking with commercial growers or visiting the farms that are in your local area, or just simply interviewing those that are gardening all around the world right here on this podcast. And spending hundreds of hours talking with people throughout this industry is that agriculture is rarely black and white. Usually it has its shades of gray. So some ideas, they last for decades, and sometimes it's for centuries. Some are useful and have some kind of purpose behind them, while some ideas have incredibly strong scientific evidence behind them. Others are just interesting observations, but simply haven't even been studied enough yet. And then some, they deserve ultimately to be retired. One thing that I love about gardening is that the curiosity aspect, it never stops. The science ends up evolving, techniques improve over time, and sometimes long-held beliefs, they start to become confirmed. Sometimes they're just completely disproven. Sometimes we simply discover that we are asking all the wrong questions. And that's the part that makes gardening absolutely fascinating to me. So throughout today's episode, we're going to be going through 3 different categories. One is, of course, what we know. These things are the things that are supported consistently by research and decades of practical use. Number two, what we think that we know. These are simply the observations that appear promising, but still need stronger evidence. And finally, what is mostly the myth? Or ultimately, at least hasn't been demonstrated under a controlled condition enough. And then here's something that I want you to remember throughout this whole entire episode. Simply put, copper isn't magic, but it isn't something meaningless either. Like almost every tool in the overall gardening scene, it's about understanding where it belongs, not expecting it to just solve every single problem. But today, we're going to uncover what copper actually does inside a plant and why plants need tiny amounts of it and why too much of it becomes toxic, why copper fungicides have been trusted over a century now, and whether burying copper pipes and wires actually helps the plant. The truth is really about electroculture and how copper behaves differently in outdoor soil, raised beds, containers, and even hydroponic systems. We'll compare things like copper with galvanized steel, copper versus aluminum, copper versus iron versus stainless steel, and other common materials that gardeners build with in general. We'll discuss the indoor growing, we'll discuss the hydroponics, the deep water culture, the ebb and flow, the aeroponics, and we will finish by talking about practical ways to decide whether copper belongs in your gardening and growing system. But just like our recent episodes, when we get into the scientific topics, I'm going to just go ahead and pause at those and explain them in what I can detect as like simple, plain English. There's going to be no advanced chemistry degree that's ultimately going to be required for you to know about what you're doing. You don't need to be a master horticulturist to know all this stuff. Just practical information that you can actually use. So go ahead, grab your notebook, grab your favorite spicy snack, or start checking on those pepper seedlings while you listen, because today we're separating gardening fact from gardening folklore. Let's jump on in. So before you decide whether copper belongs in our gardens, we first have to answer a much, much simpler question. What exactly is copper doing in there in the first place? So let's begin with something that surprises a lot of newer growers or those that are just not familiar with gardening in general. Copper is not anything that's artificially, chemically invented by the agriculture system. It's a naturally occurring element. In fact, it's found almost everywhere, in rocks, in water, in soil, and yes, also inside plants, animals, and even inside of you. Your body actually requires tiny amounts of copper to stay healthy. Plants, well, they're the exact same. So copper is what is called ultimately a micronutrient. Now, don't let that word intimidate you. Here's the simple explanation. Plants, they need nutrients in different quantities. Some nutrients, like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, are needed in relatively larger amounts. Those are called macronutrients. Think of those as the main meals, as to where copper belongs to another group called micronutrients. Micronutrients are needed in extremely small amounts. Think of things like vitamins. You don't need pounds of vitamin C, you just need a tiny amount. Copper works much the same way, but for plants, but absolutely essential. So, what does copper actually do? Copper helps activate important enzymes. Now, that's obviously another scientific word here, so let me just break this down simply for you. Enzymes are like, think of them as tiny biological helpers. They are almost like a specialized employee inside the factory. The factory in this case being the plant. Each one has a specific job. Some help produce energy, some build plant tissue, and some help defend the plant against disease. Without enough workers, the factory slows down. Without enough enzymes, the plant slows down. So copper helps many of those enzyme systems function correctly. It also plays an important role in photosynthesis. So now there's a little bit of a small clarification here that needs to be addressed. Copper itself does not directly create the chlorophyll. Instead, it supports several of those enzyme systems that we talked about earlier, but those enzyme systems, they allow for photosynthesis to happen efficiently. So think of it like this. Imagine building a car, except for copper isn't the engine, it isn't the wheels. It's one of the tools needed to really just assemble everything correctly. Without the tool, the car still exists, but the process doesn't work nearly as well. Copper also contributes to the lignin production. So a simple explanation of what lignin is what gives the plants itself its strength. Think of it like the framing to the inside of a house. Without good framing, the walls start to flex. The structure weakens. The plants here are absolutely similar. Lignin strengthens the stems. It helps support the water movement in the plant. It helps the plant remain upright. Copper also contributes to the natural defense system inside the plant. And it's not because copper is some magical shield that's going to come out there and just put a barrier around your plant, but because the healthier the plant generally defends itself better than, say, like a stressed plant. So here's where things become really interesting. So copper has two completely different roles within gardening. The first is that it's a nutrient. The second is it's a disease management tool. These are ultimately not the same thing. So let's think like the plant here and imagine that you, right now, are a pepper plant. Pick whatever you want. Go ahead. Think about it. All right. Got it? Now, stay with me here. Your roots are consistently absorbing tiny amounts of nutrients from the soil. So you're just sitting there, you're absorbing. You're picking up things like nitrogen. Oh, thank you. Oh, potassium. Oh, man, that was great potassium. Calcium, magnesium, iron, zinc, and yes, of course, tiny amounts of copper. Your goal here is overall balance. It's not simply to have excess of things. It's not to have a deficiency into things, but to find balance. Now, imagine someone suddenly dumps a huge amount of one nutrient into the system. Remember, you're the plant here. Suddenly, everything changes. It's kind of like inviting 100 people, ultimately, to a restaurant that's only built to handle and support 20 people eating in it. Nothing functions normally anymore. That brings us to one of the oldest principles in biology. The dose makes the poison. The idea dates back hundreds of years, and it's ultimately incredibly important to remember. Water keeps us alive, but too much water can make us sick. Sunlight grows plants, but too much sunlight burns plants. Fertilizer feeds the overall crop, but too much fertilizer can kill the crops. Copper follows the exact same rule. Tiny amounts, that's essential. Excessive amounts, well, that's where things start to get harmful. And understanding that specific balance is the foundation for everything else that we are discussing here today. Now, let's switch gears here a little bit. Because most gardeners don't first encounter copper because of plant nutrition. They encounter copper because of disease control. Things like copper fungicides have been ultimately used for well over, let's say, 100 years now. One of the most famous examples is something called Bordeaux mixture. This ultimately dates back to the vineyards in France during the late 1800s. Growers were struggling with a devastating fungal disease. Researchers discovered that combining copper sulfate with lime ultimately created an effective protectant against many of the fungal pathogens. That discovery changed agriculture. Eventually, copper-based fungicides spread into orchards. They spread into the vegetable production, things like tomatoes, potatoes, peppers, fruit trees, and many other crops. And even today, they remain one of the most widely used fungicides, both conventional and organic production. So now, why does copper work? The simple explanation here is that copper ions, they interfere with the important proteins and enzymes inside of the fungal and bacterial cells. So ultimately, think of it like this. It's removing the spark plugs from the engine. The engine itself still exists, but it can't function properly. That essentially is what copper is doing to many of these disease-causing organisms. However, and this is very important, copper doesn't know the difference between a harmful organism and a beneficial one. That's why repeated use requires very thoughtful management, because a healthy soil isn't empty. Healthy soil is alive. And that's where the conversation gets a little bit more interesting, because before we can understand what copper is doing to the plants, we first need to understand what it is doing underneath the overall surface, specifically speaking, to the soil itself. And trust me, there is an entire hidden world beneath your feet that's working harder than even most people begin to realize. So what happens to the soil and the plants? So we've talked a little bit about how copper ultimately, as a recap here, is a micronutrient and as one of agriculture's oldest fungicides. But now we're going to get into a little part here that I think is a little bit more fascinating, because copper doesn't just affect the plant, it affects the entire ecosystem surrounding that plant. And if you're listening to the podcast for any length of time, you've probably heard me say that healthy gardens aren't just a collection of plants. They're a living, thriving ecosystem. And every handful of healthy soil contains millions, sometimes even billions of living organisms. Things like bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, earthworms, arthropods, microbes we haven't even really been able to identify yet. And that's all working together down below. They're cycling the nutrients, breaking down organic matter. They're protecting roots, holding in that moisture, moving those minerals around. In many ways, your soil is just as alive as the pepper plant is growing in it. And when we start to add things like copper, whether intentionally or unintentionally, we're not just affecting one organism, we're influencing really the entire community around. Let's do something a little bit different here. Let's stop thinking like we're gardeners just for a minute and think like we're soil. Imagine that you're looking underground, not at dirt, but at a city. Think of it just spanning in front of you, because that's really what healthy soil is. Imagine millions of tiny workers, construction crews, electricians, delivery drivers, recycling centers, security guards, water treatment plants, communication networks, everybody has a job down there. Some organisms, they recycle old leaves, while others unlock nutrients. Some defend plant roots from harmful fungi, and others, they build soil structures, while some just simply store nutrients for later. Now imagine something that affects the whole city, sometimes even influences it for the positive, but sometimes it's neutral, and sometimes it creates an unintended consequence. Copper is one of those influencers. So here's one of the biggest misconceptions that I hear. People often think, if I bury this copper pipe, the copper will immediately spread everywhere. But that's not really how that works. Copper moves through the soil relatively slow. And what it does depends on several different factors. Things like your soil's pH, the organic matter, the overall clay content, how much moisture do you have, what is your average temperature like, and what is the microbial activity going on. Even how the copper entered the soil in the first place, copper doesn't behave the same way in every single garden. And that's one reason you'll hear completely different experiences from different growers. So now you've probably heard about gardeners talking about the pH before. pH simply tells you how acidic or how alkaline something is. Think of it like a sliding scale. Lower numbers, those are more acidic. The higher numbers, they're more alkaline. Well, neutrality sits around 7, but here's ultimately why and where this matters. Copper behaves indifferently depending on where it sits on this scale. In acidic soils, copper becomes more readily available. You might be thinking, that sounds really good. I like that idea. All the way until you realize that too much availability can really ultimately become toxicity. Think of it like sugar in coffee. A little bit, it ultimately dissolves nicely, but you keep adding spoonful after spoonful, and eventually you get far more than you wanted. The plants, they're ultimately experiencing something similar. In alkaline soils, copper tends to bind much more tightly. So what does this mean to you? It means that it still is present, but think of it as less immediately available for uptake purposes. Neither extreme is ideal. What really wins here is finding balance. So next, let's talk about the organic matter to this soil. Organic matter, for those that may not be familiar with this or you're wanting to have a refresh on this, organic matter is the decomposed plant and animal material that helps make the soil healthy. Things like compost, old roots, leaves, microbial material. Healthy soils usually contain plenty of these. Organic matter acts almost like a savings account. Instead of nutrients immediately washing away, many become temporarily stored, really slowly, and buffered over time. Copper often binds to this organic matter, which can reduce the sudden spikes in availability. This is one reason why healthy soils often handle micronutrients better than depleted soils. Healthy soil doesn't just eliminate mistakes, it simply becomes more forgiving for what you have going on. All right, so let's talk about clay and cation exchange capacity. Now, here's one of those scientific terms that really sounds extremely intimidating. Cation exchange capacity, or CEC. So don't let the name scare you away. Very simply put, just imagine two different sponges. You got one tiny and one that's huge. Which one holds more water? Obviously, the larger sponge does. Soil works similarly here. Some soils hold nutrients extremely well, while others do not. Clay soils generally hold on to nutrients much, much tighter than the sandy soil counterparts. And that holding ability is called the cation exchange capacity. Think of CEC like parking spaces. Every nutrient needs somewhere to park. Calcium needs somewhere to park. You need to have magnesium park somewhere, potassium, copper, iron, zinc. They are all competing for available spots within your parking lot. A healthy soil has enough parking available for everything to remain balanced. When one nutrient becomes excessive, it starts taking up too many of the spaces. Now suddenly other nutrients are starting to have a hard time finding room. That leads us into something growers often see all of the time: hidden deficiencies. Now, hidden deficiencies surprise a lot of people. Sometimes a plant has enough nutrients in the soil, but acts deficient. So then you're sitting there going, what's going on? Did I mess something up? And you're trying to react without really understanding what's going on. You're going, how has this happened? Well, it comes down to competition. So let's go back to that parking lot. Imagine that there are plenty of iron available, but copper is occupying too many parking spaces. The iron is present, but the plant struggles to access it efficiently. Now, leaves begin yellowing, growth slows, and the grower adds more fertilizer. But what happened? Fertilizer was not the issue. Balance was. And this is why soil testing can be incredibly valuable. You're not just sit there left guessing, you're accurately measuring. One of my favorite words in today's podcast is going to be rhizosphere. If you've never heard that word before, don't worry. The rhizosphere is like a tiny zone in the soil directly surrounding the plant's roots. Think of it as the downtown to the overall city. It is where the most action is happening as to where the roots have started to release sugars. The microbes are then there feeding on those sugars, and then those microbes are releasing nutrients, and then the plants are absorbing those nutrients, and it turns into an incredible partnership here. Scientists sometimes refer to this as the plant microbiome. Very similar to how humans have beneficial bacteria living in our digestive systems, plants have a beneficial microbial community too. They have healthy roots, healthy microbes, healthy plant. Now, here's where copper enters the conversation. Copper doesn't choose who it affects. Once again, going back, talking about it will affect the beneficial organisms, it will affect the diseased organisms. They are all exposed when copper is there. That's why responsible copper use matters. It's not simply about protecting peppers. It's about protecting the biological community that helps peppers thrive. All right, so let's pause for a quick myth check. Myth number 1, copper sterilizes soil. In reality, that's an absolute no. Healthy soils are incredibly resilient. Small, responsible copper applications won't initially destroy your garden, but repeated heavy use, especially over many years, can gradually shift microbial populations and the biological activity. Again, remember today's theme. Copper isn't magic, but it isn't meaningless either. So here's something that's absolutely unique about copper. Unlike many organic compounds, copper doesn't simply disappear. It doesn't evaporate. It doesn't break down into something. It is an element. And that means it stays. It may move. It may bind to soil particulates. It may become more or less available, but the copper itself, that remains. Think of it like putting pennies into a jar. 1 penny, not too much. 10 pennies, things are still manageable there. You put 10,000 pennies, now you've got a heavy, heavy jar. Copper works very similar here. One carefully timed fungicide application, usually not a major concern. Repeated applications, though, year after year, decade after decade, now accumulation becomes something worth monitoring. This is why vineyards and orchards have relied on copper fungicides for generations. Sometimes they undergo soil testing specifically for just those copper levels. Not because the copper is inherently bad, but because long-term management matters. Earlier, we briefly mentioned a word called phytotoxicity. So a simple explanation of phytotoxicity is a plant injury caused by something that we have applied. Sometimes it can be simple as copper, sometimes it's another product, sometimes it's even the fertilizers we used. Symptoms, they may indicate things like leaf burn, or stunted growth, or darkened roots, or just ultimately poor nutrient uptake, reduced vigor in the plant. Now, here's an important point. Growers sometimes mistake phototoxicity for disease. They assume that a fungus is getting worse, but when in reality, the treatment itself is the thing that has absolutely stressed out the plant. And this is why reading labels, understanding weather conditions, and applying these products at the proper time is so important. An example here, let's imagine that a generic pepper farm notices that there's a sign of an overall bacterial spot after several weeks of just extreme rainy weather. I'm sure you've experienced this. Now, that grower is going to decide to use a labeled copper fungicide. And of course, they're going to be following along to the manufacturer's directions. The disease, it starts to slow significantly. And I know what you're thinking, success. But the following year, the same strategy works again. But instead of evaluating the disease pressure, the grower begins spraying every single year, whether disease is present or not. And then after many seasons, soil testing reveals that elevated copper levels has started to interfere with the microbial activity and cause it to decline. You start to notice that your earthworm population decreases. And now the grower isn't dealing with a copper problem. Now they're dealing with a management problem. The lesson? The tool wasn't the issue. The strategy itself was the problem. So now that we understand something incredibly important, that copper doesn't exist in isolation, and every decision we make influences the biology beneath our feet. But what about all those videos showing copper pipes, copper wire, and elaborate antennas supposedly pulling energy from the atmosphere? Can copper really increase the plant growth without fertilizer? Or are we looking at one of gardening's biggest modern myths? That's exactly where we're heading to next. And I have a feeling that that section is going to surprise quite a few people. So far, we've spent most of our time talking about gardens, raised beds, containers, and outdoor soil, places where nature provides plenty of incredible buffering systems. But now let's move indoors, because once we leave traditional soil behind, the rules here, they start to begin to change. And in some cases, they change dramatically. One of the biggest mistakes I see online is people assuming that because something works outside, it must work the same way inside. And unfortunately, plants don't always agree with that logic. Indoor growing, especially in hydroponics, is completely different environment. And understanding those differences is one of the biggest steps towards becoming a much better grower. So let's imagine that once again, you are a pepper plant. Outside, your roots are surrounded by millions of soil particulates, organic matter, clay, sand, microbes, fungi, water pockets, air pockets. It's all incredibly complex environment. Now imagine someone removes all of that. Now you have no soil, no buffering, you have no organic matter, no earthworms, no clay. Your roots are now sitting directly in water. Every nutrient, every mineral, every dissolved metal, every pH change, every temperature fluctuation, everything reaches your roots almost immediately. That is hydroponics. Hydroponics removes much of nature's buffering system. That means plants often grow faster, sure, but mistakes also happen a lot faster. So why is soil more forgiving? Remember when we talked about how organic matter and clay and those materials that help hold nutrients slow them down? They reduce sudden changes, and think of the soil as like that sponge and how it absorbs, it releases, and it balances. Well, hydroponics doesn't have that sponge. Instead, your nutrient solution is ultimately like a soup. Everything is already dissolved and everything is there and ready for the uptake. That's one of the reasons why hydroponic plants can grow incredibly quick. But that's also why nutrient mistakes ultimately become visible much, much sooner. So let's spend a minute talking about the overall root system, because roots are doing far more than holding the plant upright. Roots are consistently taking in water, oxygen, and nutrients. They're also communicating with the environment around them. Healthy roots are usually bright white. They're firm, well-balanced, actively growing, and when roots end up becoming stressed, everything above ground eventually starts to reflect it. As above, so below. A little bit of esoteric knowledge there. You have things like the leaves are going to show it, the flowers are going to show it, the fruits are going to show it, and the overall growth are going to start showing everything that starts within the roots, which means anything affecting the roots deserves your attention. So let's begin with the easiest setup. Traditional potting soil, grow bags, fabric pots, large indoor containers. These systems behave much more like the outdoor containers than the hydroponic setup. You've got still your organic matter, and you still have some form of buffering. You still have microbes, and so many of the same principles are still applying here. Copper fungicides can absolutely have a place when used correctly, particularly if you're dealing with disease that copper is labeled to manage. But here's where I become cautious. I personally don't recommend burying copper wire, copper pipes, or copper scraps on your indoor containers. Why? Well, it's simple. Limited volume. Imagine placing a teaspoon of salt into say a swimming pool. Now, place that same teaspoon into a coffee mug. It's a very different concentration. Indoor containers are much more closer to, say, that coffee mug, and that small system ends up amplifying any form of mistakes. So let's talk hydroponics. Now that we're entering into that conversation of hydroponics, if you've never grown in hydro before, don't let the word really intimidate you here. Hydroponics is simply the means of growing plants without traditional soil. Instead, the roots receive water, oxygen, and nutrients. There are many different styles, and each has its strength. Each one also has its weakness, and each one handles copper completely different. You have flood and drain, also called ebb and flow. So The system periodically will flood the plant roots with nutrient solution and then, as it says, drain it away. Think of like the ocean tide. Water comes in, water goes out. The roots receive both nutrients and oxygen. It's honestly a pretty clever design. Now, what happens if that copper enters that nutrient solution? Because that solution is reused, and small changes can slowly accumulate. Copper fittings, copper plumbing, supplemental copper, they all deserve caution. And again, it's not that I'm saying that it's a disaster to automatically happen if you're, say, using these in your system. But what I'm saying is the hydro system rewards precision. So if algae is your problem, there are usually better first choices than introducing copper. The system sanitation, just by, taking care of and cleaning the system itself, is probably one of the first places I would actually focus on and start. Things like light exclusion, reservoir management, and beneficial microbes in there, these generally would be your first starting point. Next, we have deep water culture, or DWC. This is probably one of the most recognizable hydroponic systems. This is where the plant roots remain suspended directly inside of an oxygenated nutrient reservoir. I want you to make sure you understood that. DWC, in order for it to be DWC, needs an oxygenated nutrient reservoir. Think of it like an underwater buffet. Everything the plant needs is immediately available, which sounds fantastic until something undesirable enters the overall water. Because remember, there's no soil that's acting as a sponge. So everything dissolved in that reservoir is immediately available to the roots, including that copper. And that's why I generally advise against the intentionality of placing copper pipes or copper fittings or any other kind of copper components directly into a DWC reservoir. Not because the copper is inherently bad, but because the margin of error becomes much smaller. So here is another example, using that DWC method to give you a better understanding here. A hobby grower, let's say, notices some algae developing in their DWC system. After watching several online videos, they decide placing a copper tube inside the reservoir. Initially, everything appears to be fine. Several weeks later, new roots become darker, growth is now starting to slow, and leaf edges begin showing stress. After removing the copper, cleaning the reservoir, improving the light control, and increasing oxygenation, the new roots, that growth starts to return healthy. So you're thinking, okay, was the copper the only factor? Maybe, but maybe not. But the introduction of another variable that didn't need to be there, good growers eliminate unnecessary variables whenever and wherever possible. So this next one here is called NFT, Nutrient Film Technique, not non-fungible tokens like some of us that are in the crypto space might know, but nutrient film technique. So NFT systems are fascinating. Instead of the roots sitting in deep water, a very thin stream or sometimes a film of nutrient solution constantly flows across the root system as where plants start to receive that water, nutrients, and oxygen simultaneously. Because the water volume is relatively small, changes can also happen very quick. That includes obviously things like your pH, the temperature of the solution, and the nutrient concentration and dissolved metals. Again, here we go. We're talking again about this. Precision is going to matter immensely with this. One small mistake affects the whole entire system rapidly. Then we have aeroponics. Now that we've reached one of the most advanced type of growing system, aeroponics, instead of sitting in soil or sitting in water, the roots literally hang in the air. And every few minutes, there's a little bit of a misted solution, and it kind of sounds very futuristic, but honestly, kind of is. So these systems can produce phenomenal growth, but they're also extremely sensitive. Remember earlier how we talked about how soil acting as the sponge? Well, aeroponics removes that sponge absolutely completely out of the equation. Now, imagine spraying dissolved copper directly onto, say, your exposed roots. Now, there's nowhere for that copper to bind first. There's no clay, no organic matter, no buffering, which is why precision becomes absolutely crucial. Things like algae. We can kind of spend a little bit of time here talking about algae because this is usually why copper even comes up in the first place when talking about hydroponics. Algae itself isn't always devastating, but it competes for the overall oxygen that the plant would normally get. It creates the need for maintenance, and it can contribute to the biofilm formation really that's going on. Now, rather than immediately reaching for the copper, I would advise and encourage growers to start to ask, like, why is this algae growing? Usually, light is reaching that nutrient solution. It's a pretty simple fix. You just block out the light, then the algae needs the light to thrive. If no light, then that means much less algae. Also, you can consider things like the reservoir temperature, the system cleanliness, your water movement, your water usage, how you're going about that. And then, of course, the beneficial bacteria. Things like hydrogen peroxide products, specifically designed for, say, a hydroponic system when appropriate. Those can really help address the cause that usually works better than, say, continually treating for the symptom. So let's pause real quick again for another myth check. If copper kills algae, more copper must be even better. In reality, no. Once again, remember, your pepper roots are living tissue too. So anything capable of disrupting the biological system deserves careful management. The goal isn't maximum copper. You're not growing a copper plant. The goal is healthy roots, always healthy roots. So then let's imagine that you're the root system. You're surrounded by fresh oxygen, your balanced nutrients, you got some clean water going on. Everything feels stable. Now, someone suddenly changes the chemistry. You see the plant gardener coming over there. You're the plant. Once again, you're the root system. You see a crack of light. Suddenly, something changes the chemistry. Maybe it's copper. Maybe it's fertilizer. Maybe it's the pH. Maybe the temperature's fluctuated. You don't know what changed. You just simply respond. Roots don't care about the internet trends. They don't respond to any of that. They respond to the chemistry. That's the one reason successful hydro growers become excellent observers. They are consistently asking what has changed because in hydro, small changes rarely stay small for very long. So we've covered copper in outdoor gardens, in containers, indoor soil, and now hydroponics. But copper isn't the only metal gardeners build with. What about galvanized steel? What about aluminum, iron, brass, stainless steel, food-grade plastics? How do all of these compare? And which material actually belongs around food crops and which ones deserve a little more thought? That's exactly where we're headed to next. So far, we have spent a lot of time talking about copper, but copper isn't the only material that gardeners use. Ultimately, If you've ever walked through, say, a gardening center or visited a farm or looked at raised bed kits online, you've probably seen several different materials being marked as the best. Galvanized steel, aluminum, stainless steel, iron, wood, concrete blocks, plastic, composite materials, each have advantages, each have disadvantages. And here's something that I want you to remember. There probably isn't one perfect material out there. There is only materials that are better suited for certain situations. That's an important distinction here because gardening is full of options. My goal today is to help you think through some of those options, not just simply replace one option for another. So imagine you're planning your dream pepper garden. You have a giant blank space, no beds, no containers, no irrigation, nothing. Someone walks up to you and asks, "What are you going to build with it?" Most people immediately think about the cost, and why that's completely understandable, definitely in today's economy. But experienced growers usually ask different questions. How long do I want this to last? Will this be a permanent setup? Will this be movable? How much maintenance will this require? And how will it affect the overall soil temperature? Will it react with moisture? Will it leach anything into the growing environment? Will it be safe around edible crops? Those questions usually lead to much better decisions than just simply asking, what's the cheapest? So let's begin with one of the most popular options for today. That's galvanized steel. Galvanized steel is regular steel that has been coated with zinc. The zinc coating protects the steel from, say, rusting quickly. That's why galvanized beds have become so popular. They're very durable. They're relatively lightweight, easy to assemble, and they often last for many, many years. Now, one question I hear consistently is, does the zinc leach into the soil? The answer is yes. Small amounts can over time. But here's the important part. Plants don't actually need zinc. Just like the copper, it's another micronutrient. And again, the same theme returns. Small amount is beneficial. Excessive amounts is problematic. Most galvanized beds, usually under normal gardening conditions, have not been shown to create widespread zinc toxicity or problems from home vegetation gardens. With that said, if you're gardening in an extremely acidic soil or you're using a poor quality coating, leaching can increase. And that's another reason why soil testing every few years is a very smart practice. So what's next? Well, aluminum, of course, comes to mind because it's lightweight, it's rust resistant, and, well, it's very easy to move. Aluminum beds have become more common, while one concern that people often raise is, what about aluminum toxicity? And here's where the soil chemistry matters again. Under normal gardening conditions, aluminum remains relatively stable. In very acidic soils, however, more aluminum can become available. And again, context matters. The material itself isn't automatically dangerous. The environment influences its behavior. Because one thing I appreciate about aluminum is its resistance to rust. Its one trade-off, though, it generally doesn't retain heat quite as well as, say, steel. So whether that's good or bad, depending on your entire climate, if you're gardening in the northern climate, where warmer soils may help extend your growth season, if you're in, say, gardening here in Texas, like I am, where the summer temperatures can be brutal, additional heat isn't always something that you're looking for. So remember, there's rarely just one right answer. One of the biggest advantages of stainless steel is its stability. It doesn't rust easily. and it doesn't readily react with most garden conditions. And it's widely used in, say, food processing because of the durable and relative inert nature to it. So, why doesn't everyone build gardens out of, say, stainless steel? Simple. Comes down to cost. It's significantly more expensive than galvanized steel or aluminum. For many home gardeners, the added cost simply isn't justified. But if you're building long-term hydroponic system or a commercial food processing equipment, stainless steel is often preferred choice because of its durability and corrosion resistance. The next one up is iron. And it's really an interesting one because unlike copper, iron is often added intentionally to correct deficiency. And you've probably seen products labeled cleated iron. Cleated means that the iron is bound to, say, another molecule, and that molecule keeps that iron readily available for the plant to take up. Think of it as putting a valuable package into a protective shipping box so that it reaches its destination. Iron plays a huge role in the overall chlorophyll production. When peppers become iron deficient, new leaves turn yellow while the veins themselves often remain green. That is called interveinal chlorosis. So it is simply just yellow between their veins. So the green veins are still remaining, but you're seeing yellow everywhere else. It's often one of the easiest nutrient deficiencies to ultimately recognize. Unlike copper, iron usually isn't being added through, say, construction materials. It's added through fertilizers or nutrient amendments. So when testing shows it's needed, you typically add it. Next, we have brass. So brass deserves a quick mention here because people often confuse it with copper, and brass is not pure copper. It's ultimately an alloy. So meaning it is made up of by combining, say, copper with another metal. Most commonly, that other metal is zinc. And some older brass fittings also contained lead. Modern plumbing regulations have significantly reduced the allowable lead levels in the potable water fittings, but it's still a good reminder to choose components intended for food or drinking water applications when building an irrigation or hydroponic system. Just remember, when in doubt, food-safe materials are worth the overall investment. So now that kind of leads us to the next point here. Some of the best hydroponic systems in the world use plastics, specifically food-grade plastics. Materials like PVC for plumbing where appropriate, HDPE, the high-density polyethylene, and food-grade reservoirs. These materials don't add nutrients to the water. They simply are containers. And for many hydroponic systems, that's exactly what you want. You want predictability. The less your plumbing influences your water's chemistry, the easier it becomes to manage the nutrients. So I know what you're thinking. This question comes up consistently. Can I use pressure-treated lumber, say, for raised beds? And the answer today is very different than it was, say, decades ago. Older pressure-treated lumber often contained arsenic-based preservatives. Modern residential pressure-treated lumber in many countries use different preservative systems. So even so, many vegetable gardeners still prefer natural rot-resistant woods like cedar or redwood, or they like line-treated lumber with food-safe barriers to minimize direct soil contact. Again, it's about understanding the material rather than simply following the internet's advice. Things like concrete blocks and cinder blocks are another common choice. One question I hear here often is, do they often leach harmful chemicals? Well, modern cinder block products generally differ from the older cinder blocks. People often worry about one particular consideration. And that is the fresh concrete can temporarily influence the soil pH where it's in a direct contact with the overall growing media there. But over time, this effect usually diminishes. So if you're building a permanent raised bed using concrete, it can be extremely durable. Just keep the drainage, the soil testing, and long-term maintenance in mind whenever you do so. So after looking at all these materials, where does copper fit? And here's my perspective. Copper is unique. It has a genuine antimicrobial and antifungal property. That's something that most other materials we discussed here don't really offer. But those same properties are exactly why moderation matters. Copper is a fantastic tool, and when there's a reason to use it, copper isn't something I just incorporate, say, in every part of the growing system simply because, well, it's copper. But remember that purpose drives the decision. It's not about the popularity of this. So let's do another quick myth check. The most expensive materials always grow the best plants. Well, reality says no, healthy plants care much more about the light, the water, the nutrition, the temperature, and the airflow. And healthy roots, whether in the raised bed is made from galvanized steel or cedar, those materials matter, sure, but management matters even more. Another example here is imagine that there's, say, let's go with two different gardeners. You have gardener A that spends thousands of dollars on premium raised beds, but never tests the soil, overwaters constantly, and ignores pest issues. Then you have gardener B. Gardener B is building simple beds from quality materials. They're monitoring their soil health. They are watering consistently, and they're rotating crops and keeping good records of what's been there. At the end of the season, who do you think is going to harvest better peppers? Most of the time, it's going to be gardener B. Not because of the materials, because of the management. And that's one of the biggest lessons that I've learned from talking with commercial growers, with local farms, and those that are growing peppers all around the world. A good system beats out an expensive system, and nearly every time, too. So if someone asked me, Brandon, what materials should I use? My answer would probably be another question. What are you trying to accomplish? If you're building a hydroponic system, I'd lean more towards materials that are stable, food safe, and unlikely to influence the water chemistry. If you're building a raised bed, I would probably prioritize durability, drainage, and long-term maintenance. If you're dealing with slug pressure, copper tape may be worth trying, but as a broader strategy. If you're managing something specific, like, say, fungal diseases, a labeled copper fungicide may be an excellent tool here. Just remember to use it when responsibly. Copper deserves neither blind praise nor a blanket commendation. It deserves understanding. One thing I noticed over the years is that the gardeners often swing between those extremes. One season, everyone says a product is the next miracle. A few years later, the internet declares it completely worthless. Reality usually lives somewhere in the middle. Copper is no different here. Used thoughtfully, it has legitimate value. Used carelessly, it can become another problem that you're trying to solve. And that's why I would rather teach principles than promote products. Products change. Principles don't. So before you add anything, understand what you're starting with. If you're serious about growing peppers, or really any crop for that nature, consider having your soil tested every few years. A soil test is like getting a physical at the doctor's office. Instead of guessing about what's going on, you're measuring what's going on. You'll learn things like your pH, the overall organic matter that's there, the major nutrients that you have available, those micronutrients that you have available, and sometimes even trace metals, depending on the test that you end up ordering, that are far more valuable than trying to diagnose every single problem by looking at the leaves alone. Remember, your plants tell you something is wrong. A soil test often tells you why. One season usually doesn't define a garden. 5 years might. 10 years definitely will. Every decision you make today becomes part of your soil's future. Compost adds up, organic matter builds, microbial diversity grows, but so can repeated inputs. Whether that's fertilizer, salts, or copper, one application isn't usually the story. Repeated applications become the story. So ask yourself, if I continue doing this for the next 10 years, what will my garden look like? That is a powerful question. So use copper as a tool, not as a routine, not as insurance, not because someone on social media told you to. Use it because you have a reason. Maybe you're dealing with a bacterial spot. Maybe your extension office recommends a copper fungicide under specific conditions. Maybe you had success using copper tape as one layer to the overall slug management plan. That is thoughtful gardening. There is a difference using a tool than depending on a tool. The more experienced growers I meet, the less they rely on a single solution. Instead, they're busy building systems, increasing healthy soil, good airflow, proper spacing, crop rotation, and resistant varieties. They're regularly scouting. They're looking for those beneficial insects. And when necessary, they carefully select products like copper that fits into that toolbox. It shouldn't become the toolbox. If there's one message I hope sticks with you today, it's this. Healthy soil grows healthy plants. Not perfect soil, healthy soil. That means protecting your organisms, working beneath the surface, ultimately those earthworms, beneficial fungi, nitrogen-fixing bacteria, mycorrhiza being that beneficial fungi that forms partnerships with your plant's roots. So think of them as the underground delivery service. The fungus helps the plant reach water and nutrients that the roots alone might miss. The healthier that underground community becomes, the more resilient your garden often becomes. And that's why I encourage growers to think beyond this year's harvest. Grow the soil, and the soil helps you grow your plants. Some best practices that might sound boring, but this is one of the habits that separates experienced growers from frustrated growers. So write these down. What variety did you plant? When did disease first appear? What product did you use? And of course, how much? What was the weather like? Did that product work? How long did it work for? And the next season, you won't be relying on your memory. You'll be relying on your experience that's been documented. That's incredibly valuable right there. So before we wrap up, let's tackle a few more rapid fire myths. Copper makes plants grow faster. Reality is that there isn't strong scientific evidence showing that simply adding copper pipes, rods, or wires to the soil consistently increases the plant growth. Healthy plants, sure, need copper, but more isn't automatically better. Myth number 2, copper fixes every disease. Once again, no. Copper is effective against certain bacterial and fungal diseases when used properly. It does not cure every plant problem. If there is a issue with, say, the nutritional side of things or the environmental side of things or the viral or it's insect related, copper may do little or nothing. Correct diagnosis always comes first. Myth number 3. If a little works, a lot must be much better. Well, that's one of the fastest ways to create problems. Whether you're talking about fertilizers, water, copper, more isn't automatically better. Balance wins every single time. Myth number 4. Copper instantly destroys the soil. In reality, responsible applications according to the label's directions are not the same thing as years of heavy accumulation. So, healthy soils are remarkably resilient, but long-term management still matters. Everything on social media is either completely true or completely false. That's myth number 5. When in reality, some ideas online are actually excellent, and some are misunderstood. Some are based on, other people's personal experience, while others are based on controlled scientific research. Good gardeners stay curious enough to ask, how do we know? That is a much better question than simply asking, who said that? So, my personal perspective here that I would like to leave you with, and I want to be very clear in my own opinion here, based on the years of learning from growers, reading research, talking with experts, and spending time in the pepper community. Personally, I don't believe copper is a miracle, and I don't believe it's a magic growth accelerator. I certainly don't believe that it's the answer to, say, like every garden challenge. But I also don't believe that we've learned everything that there is to know about it. History has shown us that science is consistently evolving. There have always been countless examples where growers observed something for years before research fully understood why it worked, or discovered only part of the original explanation was correct. That doesn't mean that every claim is true, but it also means curiosity is value. And I think that copper deserves thoughtful research, but not automatic dismissal. If future studies uncover additional uses, great. If future studies disprove certain claims, that's valuable too. Either way, we all learn. Until then, I'm going to continue recommending something that has served gardeners well for generations. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and stay open to good evidence, wherever it may lead. So if you remember nothing else from today's episode, remember these 5 ideas. 1, copper is an essential micronutrient. Plants need it, but only in small amounts. Number 2, copper is proven tool for managing certain plant diseases. Not every plant problem, but some. Outdoor soil and hydroponics are completely different environments. Never assume that practices automatically transfer from one system to another. Number 4, healthy soil biology is one of the greatest assets any gardener has. Protect it at all costs. Number 5, the best growers don't chase miracle products, they build resilient systems. That's the difference between solving today's problem and preventing tomorrow's. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you experimented with copper in your garden? Maybe you've used a copper fungicide. Maybe you've tried copper tape for slugs. Maybe you've experimented with the electroculture. Maybe you had a fantastic success using copper before, or maybe it's been a complete failure. Either way, I genuinely want to hear your overall experience. Go ahead, leave a comment wherever you are watching and listening. If you're on YouTube, go ahead and jump in the comments below and let's have a respectful discussion. One of the things I love the most about the chili growing community is that we're all consistently learning from one another. And sometimes those conversations become the future podcast episodes. So if you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or another platform that allows for a rating and review for the podcast, I'd love and appreciate that you take the time to leave one. It may seem like a small thing, but it truly helps more people discover the show. The more engagement on these platforms that they see, the more they will recommend the episodes, and other growers, gardeners, chili heads, and curious listeners all around the world. And if you know someone who's been asking, say, about copper, or maybe they've been shared one of those viral gardening videos with you recently, go ahead and send them this episode. Not to prove them wrong, not to prove yourself right, but to start a conversation that's based on evidence, experience, and curiosity. That's how the gardening community gets stronger. Before we wrap things up here, I want to say, reminder, new episodes drop every Tuesday at 8 p.m. Central, and I would like to take a moment and thank everyone who continues to support the Swear Word Podcast, whether you subscribe or you shared an episode, you've purchased some merchandise, recommended a guest, or simply listened while working in your own garden. Thank you. This podcast continues to grow because of all you. And if you are a hot sauce company, a pepper grower, a seed company, a gardening brand, an equipment manufacturer, or a business looking to reach one of the most passionate food communities anywhere, sponsorship opportunities are currently available. Head on over to theswearword.net to learn more about that. While you're there, you can go ahead and pick up some merch, join the newsletter, recommend future guests, and explore previous episodes. And become part of everything that we're building here at the Swear Word. Remember, great gardeners aren't built by chasing every trend. They've built one observation, one lesson, and one growing season at a time. Test your soil, observe your plants, ask questions, challenge the assumptions, and never stop learning. Until next time, I'm Brandon Swear, and from everything from the world of hot, this has been the Swear Word.